Hello there. My name is Daniele Nicolucci and I'm an Italian photographer, translator, and web developer. Some people lately have asked me how I create my HDR photos, such as this one. And I thought I would just make a tutorial to explain visually how I proceed to work the magic. The main thing to understand is that HDR is really a technique that is used to work around the limitation of camera sensors and film, actually, but we're talking about digital photography here. HDR stands for high dynamic range, and that's really, in a nutshell, what it is. Camera sensors are not as efficient as our eyes when it comes to recording the difference between light and dark. So in any given scene, you have to make a choice of what has to be properly exposed. And if you have a wide dynamic range, such as you have a lot of dark areas and a lot of bright areas, or rather you have a very bright area and a very dark area, you can only choose to expose correctly one of them. Typical example is when you have someone standing in front of a window and you want to take a picture of this person. Oftentimes the camera will measure the light and make and set the shutter speed and the aperture, or both, or either one of them, depending on how you're using the camera, so that you are exposing the person correctly, but the scene behind this person is completely washed out. Or vice versa, you can have the background exposed correctly while the person is only a silhouette, it's just black. And in many cases there is no way around it. Even if you were to set the camera to full manual mode, you would still be finding yourself with this limitation. The camera is just unable to record both what's behind this person, bright light that's coming behind it, and the dark person against it. So this is where HDR comes handy. Now, you don't really want to use HDR with photos where you have people, because HDR, as we will see, enhances the micro contrast in addition to the greater picture, pun intended. So when you are taking photos of people in HDR, you're also going to make their skin look much more flawed. And normally with people we want to make their skin look as flawless as possible, sometimes even going too far with that, but that's another story. So if you were to walk with me when I took this picture in Francavilla al Mare a couple of months ago, you would have seen with your eyes pretty much what you see here in this picture. I always make a point to try and replicate what I see. I'm not much for the surrealist kind of HDR necessarily, even though I sometimes have fun with that. So when I went there with my brand new 60D and my brand new Sigma 10 to 20mm lens, I found that my camera could only capture this picture. And this is a TIFF generated from the RAW file. So this has effectively no edits. I think I only fixed for distortion and chromatic aberration, but this is all I could take a picture of. As you can see, the sky, this is slightly underexposed. This was metered by the camera, and the sky is not that readable. You can see the clouds, but you can't really see the depth of the clouds. And when it comes to the ground, well, you can't see anything. You cannot see any detail in this dark area. So what I did was I used the camera bracketing function to record the zero bias. Let's just call it ground zero, if you will, the standard exposure. There is no standard nomenclature when it comes to this kind of work. So this is the standard exposure. Then I took another picture with -2 exposure bias, which allowed me to record more detail in the clouds, but everything else got dark. And the +2, which allowed me to record a lot more detail in the ground, whereas the sky is completely washed out. This is effectively the very same thing as what happens with the whole person against the window problem that I was describing earlier. So what you do effectively is blend these three pictures together and get something like this. Now, what I was talking about before about the skin, as you can notice, in none of the original photos there is much detail on this rock or on the sand, really, but when you blend them together, you're not just blending the great picture, you're also blending the details. This really happens on a pixel by pixel level. So you can see the texture of the rock, you can almost feel it in a way. You can see the sand. You can also see the depth of the little waves coming back towards me. Actually, funny enough, the waves were going upstream from the sea. So this is what you can do with HDR, and in some cases you kind of have to do HDR because in this case, for instance, this is a small square in the oldest part of my town of Chieti in Italy, central Italy. When I went there with, again, 60D, this was actually the first time I had gone out with my 60D and the 10-20mm lens. I had found this little square a few months before and I wanted to take a photo of this, so when I went there, this was mid-afternoon, around 3 o'clock, this is what I found. And as you can see, there's really no way around this. The sky is properly exposed, the building is slightly exposed, slightly overexposed if you ask me, and barely any trace of the fountain here. Now, by overexposing, I get a lot of detail back. I can finally see the road, and I can make out the shape of the fountain and effectively see what's on the wall behind it. And I lose detail on the building, and I can underexpose and get the bricks back effectively. Now you may wonder, how do you go from this is the brightest picture that I took of the bunch, to this? You can barely see anything here. Well, the answer is that this is converted from RAW files. This is 16-bit TIFF files, and if you shoot JPEG, don't do it. Upgrade to shooting RAW. As a simple example, I can show you what I did. This may look like HDR, this is not HDR by any means. This is a single photo that I took, and this is the original one. Now this is actually a DNG file converted from the CR2 file from a Canon 60D, and just by using a single RAW file, I was able to pull out a lot more detail. Using Adobe Camera Raw in this case, but you can do the same with Aperture, Lightroom, any raw processing file. I've gone from something that was very dull to getting the clouds back. You can even tell that there are clouds here. I fixed the chromatic aberrations that are visible even in the small one, in the small photo, and I was able to take out a lot more detail everywhere. So in essence, you may call this HDR. This is not strictly speaking HDR, this is more of a tone mapping. By definition, HDR proper is done with more than one input file. But it's really a very, the definition is not clear. Everyone will have a different way to approach this. Now, what you see here, this original one, is what you would have gotten, is what I would have gotten if I had set the camera to save JPEGs directly. When your camera saves JPEG files directly, it basically applies a very basic, very predetermined set of settings to process the raw data that it's just recorded on the sensor. So it applies the same details for every single photo, and the rest is discarded forever. So there would have been no way to go from this, if this were a JPEG, to this. Now, some people like the HDR look proper. Like, if you just search for HDR on Google, you will find all sorts of things. And you may or may not like this very extreme kind of HDR. Some people do, some people don't. And this photo, for instance, shows very clearly what I meant when I was talking about micro contrast. The reflections in particular in HDR tend to come to life. As you can see here, I don't know who took this picture, Sara Camilletti, apparently. It's a beautiful photo. HDR Photography, this is another typical HDR photo, and you can see the reflections here, very detailed. And in fact, it's very often used with vehicles for this reason, because they shine a lot. And you may or may not like this kind of HDR. Personally, I prefer to go for the more traditional HDR. I like to, in my mind, an HDR photo that works with my own pictures is a picture that you don't even see as being HDR. It just needs to be a beautiful picture. You wouldn't be able to tell that this was HDR probably. You just see, oh, it's a beautiful olive trees, and Flickr has a tendency to over sharpen this apparently, but I think that my own HDR photos are successful if you cannot tell that they are HDR. But that's just me. You can do it in any way you want, really. So let's go back to the actual explanation of what I do with HDR. And I'm going to use these photos that I took a couple of months ago. So this is the standard exposure here. It's not very interesting probably, but it's actually very good to show the nuances that I've learned over the past 4 years of playing with HDR. This is the -2 and this is the +2. Now this is handheld, no tripod. Can you do it without using a tripod? Yes, but you have to be careful. You have to learn the technique really. You have to be able to limit your movements, so the wider the lens, the better. And you want to be able to probably take several different shots. And I've been more effective in HDR since I got my 60D compared to my old 350D. For a simple reason, because the 350D was limited to a very slow burst speed. I found that once I used the bracketing exposure on 60D, I have better results when it comes to alignment if I use the high-speed burst mode. So within a second I have all three shots. This usually reduces the camera movement, but you still have to be careful not to overexpose in terms of, I mean, when you're doing the overexposed shot, you have to be careful not to use a shutter speed that's too slow for you. And what is correct for you is really only you can tell. So what I do first is I usually open all three pictures in Camera Raw. I'm going to use Camera Raw for this picture. And you can see that the brightest one was 1/60th of a second. Now this is a 10mm lens, there is no blur here, that's fine. The middle one is 1/250, and the darkest one is 1/1000th of a second. The aperture stays the same. This is really important. The aperture has to stay the same, and so does the focal point. Because if you start changing the focus distance or the aperture, you're gonna have different photos that will not be able to be blended in any way. So you want to have the same depth of field, most importantly. So what I do in this case is I'm just going to operate on the middle one in this case. What I want to do is I'm going to take care of the chromatic aberrations, and I want to do this on one single photo, usually the middle one, because I'm going to apply the same settings to all of them. I want to keep them as similar as possible. So in this case, I don't need to probably push this up a little bit, the fringing, and I want to apply the lens profile corrections to all of them. And since this is the same lens, there's no need to do anything peculiar about this. One thing I want to do is to apply some noise reduction by any means, because noise, just like detail, is going to be put together with three pictures. You're going to have 3 times as much noise. So we don't want to do that. So usually I zoom in. This could use a little sharpening. This lens is not very sharp on itself, but a little bit of sharpening will do wonders. And I'm going to apply some luminance, denoising, and that's usually enough. Especially in HDR, you want to apply sharpening only where it's needed, so I'm going to use the masking to avoid sharpening the sky. I don't want that, because if I were to sharpen the sky here, I would only be adding noise. So, oh, if you don't know what I'm doing, I'm just hitting the Option key on my keyboard. I don't know what it's like on Windows. I have no idea. Probably it's Control or Alt. But by keeping the Option key down, when you move the sliders, you can see where you're applying this against the picture. It makes it much more clear, much more immediate to understand what you're doing, really. So it's a very useful technique. And that's all I'm doing. I'm not playing with the white, well, I could fix the white balance maybe. In fact, I'm going to use the daylight white balance, because compared to the S-Shot, this is a bit too green. I'm going to use the daylight. But again, this varies from picture to picture. So what I'm doing here is only specific to mine. The main thing to remember is that you have to apply the sharpening if you want to, definitely apply noise reduction, and by all means fix the chromatic aberrations. If you look at my oldest HDR photos, you will see that I didn't do this. In fact, in many cases I was still doing JPEG only, and you can tell. The reason you have to remove the chromatic aberrations is that if you're going to have any alignment problems, and you will if you're doing handheld shots, it's going to look even more awful if you have chromatic aberrations 3 times on the same pictures, because you will have 3 images joined together, and you will have three batches of chromatic aberrations that will show up. So we don't want to do that. And as for the rest, I'm not going to touch anything at all. Just white balance in this case, sharpening, noise reduction, and by all means chromatic aberrations, and in this case the lens profile correction, because this lens has a tendency to be very distortion, to have a very strong distortion, especially at the wide end. So what I'm going to do afterwards, I'm just going to select all and synchronize everything. I may be doing some spot removal, but I don't really care at this point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save the images with all 3 selected. I'm going to save the images, and I'm just going to give a name. Actually, I'm going to put that into the, I usually create an HDR work folder, and I'm going to just use it there, and I'm going to call it Ballet. I will play with that later. So I'm just gonna 1-digit serial number is enough. I'm gonna save this as a TIFF file, and I'm going to compress this if I want to. Old metadata, I really don't care at this point, but it has to be a 16-bit image. So before I do that, I want to save it as 16 bits. Color space, I usually just leave it as sRGB, mostly because I'm not familiar with the others. I know I should, but I'm not. So 16 bits, this is really important. Synchronize, we have already done that, sorry. Again, let's choose the same folder as before. HDR work, oops, HDR work, select Valley. So I'm going to save that as it is, and as you can see, the compression available when you choose 16 bits is only zip. You cannot use LZW anymore. So I'm gonna save that. It's gonna take some time. It's going to be especially slow since I am recording. Okay, I didn't change the serial number, but it's not a big deal. So once this is working, I'm going to explain what I'm going to do now. I'm going to use Photomatix Pro, which is a wonderful little program to do this kind of work. Much more so than Photoshop's own HDR Pro function. I think that that's very limited. Oh, I'm not going to save the DNG file. I'm just going to cancel, because I don't care. I'm going to close Safari to get some little speed if I can. Okay. And we have the Valley. I'm just going to rename this 3 photos. And you can see that the files are big. 86, 85, 86 megabytes. Actually, I could have used the 8 bits version really, but if you want to really maximize the effects, you have to go with 16 bits. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to select all 3 and I'm going to open them in Photomatix Pro. And the order is not important, it's intelligent enough to know what picture is what. And you want to align those images and crop usually by matching features. and as it says, well, you can have two different ways, and this one is best for tripod. This is for handheld shots. So I'm going to include perspective correction, keep it at the default values. Remove ghosts. In this case, I don't have any ghosts. You want to remove ghosts when you have someone who's in the picture, or you have cars, or anything that moved in the picture. I am going to let it reduce noise and reduce chromatic aberrations. Now this is going to take a while, and you can see the CPU is going to be used quite a lot. So is the temperature going up, and the memory usage is going to go up. Now actually I could close Photoshop at this point, which I'm going to do to save some memory. And if you don't have a fast computer, or if you are low in memory, it's really best to stick with 8-bit images. Now in this case I want to give you the full range. I want to show you what it really does. So I'm going to, as I said, use 16-bit images. And once it's done, you're gonna get a little picture that looks hideous. Because what you're gonna see is an image that contains all the depth from all three originals. And as usual, this is really hideous. But believe it or not, this is what you're going to work with. So once you click on tone mapping and fusion, the fun begins. Now, I'm gonna reset everything to the defaults. Let me take this invisible thing here from QuickTime. This is what we have, and a very important thing to do is to zoom in and see whether you have any misaligned things, especially at the corners. And in this case, we don't have much, so it's fine. Even if you have some, you may want to just keep in mind you can crop this. So usually the center is where it's the clearest. Now, the loop that you see here is really important, because what you see in the preview is really just a preview, and I'm going to show you that in more detail, but this is not a one-to-one example of what you will get when you're done with the processing. Now, first thing to do, you have some presets here, and you can go through them, and as you can see, this is more of the HDR effect that some people like. The way that this is going to react with your images really depends on what's in there in the first place. So you have a lot of them, and what I usually start with is the enhanced, or the soft in this case. I like it better. A good thing to remember is to keep a reference of the original one. This is what you would have gotten on its own. So you're already getting something much better here. So let's close this. Now, a lot of these sliders that you have here are not immediately clear on what you're going to do. So my suggestion is to just go the brute force way. Move that all the way down and all the way up and see what changes. It's not very scientific, but it's a very good way to understand what each single slider does, because sometimes the difference is too subtle to tell exactly what's happening. So usually you want to keep the strength on the right part of it. Color saturation, don't worry about this, because if you push it too much, it's going to look weird. And usually with HDR you want to be way more selective than applying a general saturation to the whole picture. So I don't want to say keep it low, but keep it about middle. Luminosity, again, this changes the generic brightness, and all of this really depends on the picture. So I'm just going to play with this a little bit. One important one is the lightning adjustment. What you have here is a slider that you can move all the way from -10 to +10. And as you can see, this really changes very slightly. And it's up to you to find what you like the best. It also comes with a lightning effect checkbox that lets you kind of use defaults. And this may be enough for what you're trying to achieve, maybe not. Usually keeping the slider is better. It lets you get a much more precise adjustment. Now the more options is where the magic really happens, because this is when you can get the high dynamic range out of the picture. Now keep in mind that you don't have to necessarily keep the maximum contrast. In this case, there is no harm in pushing up the highlights, because I mean, you lose some sky here, but this is the sun. It's supposed to blow everything out, and it will look weird otherwise. So keep in mind that it's okay to push this to the edge sometimes. The white point is what changes the contrast in the picture. And now I'm just going to exaggerate this. This is completely washed out. You may think that this is washed out. Black point, same thing. I'm going to darken this. And you may think that you're losing detail. You're going back to the original, right? You may think that you're going back to the original, but you're not. Because if you look at the loop, this is the real thing. If I click on this tree here that looks completely black, and effectively is completely black if I zoom in, and so is this area here, the tree bark is almost completely black, but if I click on that, it's actually full of detail. This tree here actually has detail. It's actually too bright, I would say. This bushes here, actually these are trees, it looks like it's completely black with a bright spot, but the bright spot is not that bright compared to the tree. So what you want to do is actually hunt around with your loop and go for the brightest spot and see how dark it has to be made so that you actually get the kind of contrast, the micro contrast that you're looking for. I cannot stress this enough. What you see here is just a preview. It's not the final image. If you only base yourself on the preview here, you're going to be disappointed when you finally click process and you get the final picture. So I actually want some really blacks. Even here, this looks very hideous. It looks like there's no detail in here, but you actually can see the individual blades of grass. So this takes some time, and sometimes you will find some black spots like this. This is where you had some movement. This is ghosting actually, and you may wonder how bad is this in my pictures. I would say don't worry too much about that, because first of all, you can tweak that in Photoshop if you need to, but generally speaking, it's going to be very small. Unless you have a lot of it, it's not going to be visible. The photo I'm working on is 18 megapixels. It's over 5,000 pixels on the long edge. So a very small thing like this is 100%. It's really not going to be readable. So don't worry too much about it. So again, you play with all the sliders to, again, make sure that the darkest points have the detail that you're looking for. So color temperature may be useful, and this is usually a good idea to start playing with it at this point, because you don't want to, I mean, this is a TIFF file, it's not a RAW file anymore, so while you have a lot of detail still, you don't have that much. I mean, you're not able to do the very precise adjustments that you would be able to do in Camera Raw or in Aperture or Lightroom. Micro smoothing is very useful because, again, you have to look at the loop. It's going to do very minor adjustments that will change the final mood of the photo. And again, usually look for the great contrast areas, such as the tree bark, or more specifically the blades of grass here. So you want to, it's very subtle, as I said, sometimes you have to play it back and forth to really see what exactly it's doing. But if you look at the sky, you can see that if we keep it too low, you're gonna get that halo around the thing, around the tree. And it's not that beautiful if you ask me, so I'm going to keep that. Now also, the clouds look completely washed out, but they're not. Now you may want to bring back some detail, and micro smoothing may help. Saturation halides, you don't want to go overboard with this, because as you can see, you're gonna get patches if you go from a very brightly exposed part, such as where the sun is, to where it's more readable. So usually also you keep this pretty much to 0, because you can always do this in Photoshop later, which is what I advise. The smoothness of shadows is also going to play a big role when it comes to the final image, because as you can see, well, in this case it's not going to affect the image much, but you have to find the right spot to hunt around. So you may be wondering, what is it doing? And in this case it's not doing much. Simply put, it's not doing much. But see, if you look in the distance where you have that hill very far in the distance, well, it is doing something. And shadows clipping is pretty much the same thing. Shadows clipping is where you are actually going to lose detail. So how far you want to go to lose detail. And again, it's really more visible in the darkest areas, such as this one. And again, if you were basing yourself only on the preview, you would think this is hideous, but as you can see in the loop, it's not. We still have our beautiful tree here. It's still readable. You can see the green and the pine cones or whatever those are. Actually, it's almost too bright in a way. So we may actually want to take that down a notch. I'm going to take the white point down a little bit. But the most important thing to remember is that you're not done. So once you, let's say we are done here. If I'm going to process that, okay, it offers to add some contrast, some sharpening. Do nothing here, because Photomatix Pro is great at making HDR pictures, not so much at editing them. So don't do this. I'm just going to save. I'm just going to leave it TIFF 16 bits. I'm going to open this with Photoshop directly. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to edit the picture. Now, I'm not going to show the full edit here because that would be beyond the scope of HDR. But what I want to make clear is that you've gone from, you've gone from this picture, just close this. Actually, I can close Photomatix Pro at this point. We have gone from this picture to this picture, so we have a lot of detail that's come back. But we need to enhance this. This is very flat, so at this point we can do all sorts of usual things that we do in Photoshop to make the colors pop. So we may tweak the vibrance a little bit. Usually do that. You may just apply masks if you need. You can do the usual thing. And you're working with 16 bits, so you have much more room to play with any single pixel than you would normally have. A very useful thing at this point is to add some clarity, which I'm not sure how. Okay, because I usually do that in Camera Raw. So I'm sure clarity is somewhere around here. But generally speaking, you can also do curves, for instance. And of course, you don't want to do it too much because you may be, you may be losing detail. But you don't want to, you're gonna lose the sky. But it's no big deal. You have a mask, so all it takes is just okay, maybe a rounder brush will help. So as you can see, it's not just Photomatix Pro that lets you get the most out of HDR photos. It's really a matter of doing all the edits that you have to do afterwards. That's what I did with my photo near the river. I probably ended up with like 15 layers of minor edits, because sometimes you find that you want to get something back that you changed with another layer. So you need to apply that with the opposite settings to restore it. In this specific case, I definitely want to get rid of the flare, but this is a very simple thing. It's no big deal in this case, but sometimes you may have to get rid of things that are in the way that you don't like. You may want to apply some sharpening, so you may have to do that afterwards in order to really make it pop. And again, that depends on a picture-by-picture basis, but generally speaking, we have gone from what was very dull to a much more lively image. And granted, this is really not the best scenic image for HDR. There are many more better subjects than just a valley with a half a tree and so on, but you can see how we have definitely gotten much more detail out of this. So this is my technique for HDR. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. You may reach me on my website. I'm on Facebook. I've got a page. And if you think this tutorial was helpful and you want to give me thanks, you can share this. You may have a look at my Amazon wish list, which is ripe with things that I want for my camera. And well, you can just look at the description box and you'll find all the links there. So I hope this was helpful enough, and happy light!